Hello, and welcome to Reflections on Film. In this video, I'll be talking about Blade Runner 2049. Written by Hampton Fancher and Michael Greene and directed by Denis Villeneuve, the 2017 film acts as a sequel to 1982's Blade Runner, one of the most influential and masterfully crafted sci-fi films ever made. Before we get into this discussion, I want to encourage anyone who hasn't seen either the original or the sequel to stop this video and seek out both films. They're both thought-provoking and visually stunning, and unfortunately, despite having a large budget and talented artists in front of and behind the camera, 2049 was criminally underseen in its theatrical release. We need more films like Blade Runner 2049, so please consider supporting it and the original Blade Runner by purchasing them on video. And they're also worth seeing unspoiled, so consider this your spoiler warning, as I'll be talking about specific details from both films. Now, I've already mentioned how amazing these films are to look at, and while I could talk about the visuals all day, I'll limit my praise to pointing out how 2049 not only seems to capture the sci-fi noir aesthetic established in the original, but develops it in interesting ways while adding new visual landscapes which feel like natural extensions of that world. 2049 feels like it exists in the same universe as Blade Runner, but it's not a rote reproduction. Capturing the essence of a film that is widely regarded as a visual masterpiece, while weaving in these new elements, is a stunning achievement unto itself. But 2049 doesn't just harken back to the visual aesthetic established in Blade Runner. It also recalls the weighty themes and tone of its predecessor. So before we dig into the story of 2049, let's talk about the original Blade Runner for just a little while. Blade Runner is set in a futuristic version of 2019, where the Tyrell Corporation has created replicants, beings that are almost biologically identical to humans. Replicants are genetically modified to expire after a certain number of years and are used typically as slave labor, using genetic enhancements to do jobs on off-world colonies that are too dangerous for humans. But after a bloody rebellion, replicants were banned from Earth, and special police units called Blade Runners were created to hunt down replicants that went rogue. The film follows Deckard, a Blade Runner who is reluctantly called in to hunt down and retire a group of replicants that have returned to Earth and have made attempts to infiltrate the Tyrell Corporation. As Deckard tracks down the replicants, he meets Rachel. What he is told is a new type of replicant, one that has been implanted with memories in order to create a false sense of humanity. Deckard eventually reveals the truth to Rachel, and as the story progresses, the two form a romantic connection. Now, this film is an absolute powerhouse. Weaving together complex themes, Blade Runner asks its viewers to explore ideas like the connection between memory and selfhood, the nature of one's own mortality, and the inescapable truth that death itself is encoded into the DNA of every human being. What I really love is that it doesn't tell the viewer what or how to think about these complex ideas. It raises questions but gives no definitive answers. The director of 2049 spoke about how some of the ambiguous elements of the original film influenced his approach to making 2049 in an interview that was part of the Talks at Google series.
Questions create vertigo. Questions like one of the reasons I love sci-fi is because it's like it allows you in a very dynamic way to approach existential questions. Those existential questions brings you in contact with the unknown, which create a beautiful vertigo. And the question of the I love this feeling, and is Deckard as a human or not? For me, I love the question. The answer is less interesting for me.
Yeah, you want to keep the...
So let's take a look at the story of 2049 and see if we can pin down some of the questions the filmmakers want us to ask ourselves in order to experience that same sense of beautiful vertigo. 2049 tells the story of Joe. Joe is a Blade Runner, and at the outset of the film he goes by K, an abbreviation of the serial number given to him by his owner and creator. Joe is a replicant, but unlike the replicants hunted by Deckard in the original, he has an elongated lifespan. He's considered to be at the bottom of the social spectrum and is expected to obey orders from his human supervisors without question. He exists only to do his job, to hunt down and retire his own kind, and he's good at it. After retiring a rogue replicant hiding on Earth, Joe discovers something which threatens to upend the social structure completely. Evidence of an impregnated replicant who's given birth to a healthy child. In this era, the work of the Tyrell Corporation has been taken up by Neander Wallace, who reveals that, despite his best efforts, he's never been able to create a replicant capable of giving birth. The police instruct Joe to track down the child and kill it before it's revealed to the public, potentially inciting mass social disorder. The Wallace Corporation set out to capture the child in order to study it so that they can develop a self-propagating army of enslaved replicants. As Joe investigates the case, he starts to believe that he could be the very child he's looking for, and even discovers seemingly irrefutable evidence which forces him to confront the possibility that he was naturally born. Now, there isn't much ambiguity when it comes to Joe's arc as the story unfolds. He is a slave who comes to believe that he can be more. As the film puts it, he comes to believe that he has a soul. Eventually, we find out that he's not the child in question at all, but as a result of simply believing that he has a soul, believing that he's capable of breaking free of his social and biological programming, he actually discovers his own agency. He learns that he is free to choose his own identity, and is not bound to those constraints, which motivates him to ultimately rebel against the system. I love Joe's story, but like I said, by the end of the film, there isn't much mystery surrounding who he is and why he makes the choices he does. The character I walked away from the film scratching my head trying to figure out is the character who eventually gives Joe his human name and accompanies him throughout most of the film. And that would be Joy, a holographically displayed artificial intelligence. While the first Blade Runner delves into whether someone can own another person's genetic makeup, it never really touches on the idea of artificial machine intelligence. The film depicts a world where humans and technology have become more integrated, but the replicants in Blade Runner are not androids. They're made of exactly the same biological material as humans. The only difference is that their cells are designed to degrade after a set amount of time. While the questions about artificial biological intelligence can be applied to machine intelligence in a general sense, the topic's never really directly addressed. But Joy is something different. She isn't like humans or replicants. She's completely non-biological, a machine endowed with some level of adaptive intelligence. But when I watch the film, I can't say for sure how intelligent she really is, or how free she is to adapt or even defy her programming. We first meet Joy when Joe returns home from work, and we get a pretty clear idea of what Joy is at the outset of the film. She's a machine program designed to pacify her owner and provide the social interactions needed to simulate a fulfilling life. As she's projected around Joe's apartment from a machine arm sliding across the ceiling, we see Joy listen to Joe's stories, simulate a fresh-cooked meal for him, and constantly try to update herself to pin down and satisfy Joe's desires. This is a very interesting scene to me. On one level, we can interpret this in a very sinister way. in a way, joy is really just a system of control that's there to keep people happy with lives that have been stripped of the meaningful social interactions that humans require. And we find out later that joy, like Joe, is a product of the Wallace Corporation, further suggesting that despite appearing to be benevolent, she's really just there to keep Joe from wanting more than a simple life of slavery. But at the same time, it's not really clear just how much awareness and agency Joy is endowed with by her creator. If we look at Joy as a machine, a simple tool designed to maintain the status quo, then she comes off in a very negative light. But if we imagine that she's capable of thinking and feeling just like any of the humans or replicant characters, then her story becomes something very different. In this sense, Joy would be very much like Joe, an enslaved mind struggling to make sense of her social and genetic constraints, or in Joy's case, digital constraints, which define her experience of life. The following scene offers a justification for how the genetic code which acts as the building blocks for organic life isn't all that different from the digital code which acts as the building blocks for machine life.
Mirror data makes a man. A and C and T and G. The alphabet of you. All from 4 symbols. I'm only 2. 1 and 0.
Half as much, but twice as elegant, sweetheart.
Is it possible that Joy is more than just a tool? Is it possible that she has some sense of self-awareness and emotional intelligence, which we see develop as the story unfolds? What's interesting is that we can look at every scene featuring Joy and interpret her actions from each of these opposing perspectives. Either she is a simple machine that is totally reactive to Joe's desires, or she is a thinking and feeling mind that is making real choices based on her unique perspective and memories. I think my favorite example of this ambiguity as it applies to Joy happens just after we're introduced to her character. Joe announces that he has a gift for Joy and gives her an emanator, a piece of technology which allows her to separate from the arm that projects her hologram around the apartment. Now she can travel with Joe at all times. And in a lot of ways, this is sort of a strange version of Joe asking Joy to marry him. He doesn't want any part of his life to be separate from Joy. He wants to share everything with her. They go to the roof where Joy takes her first steps into the larger world outside of the apartment. And as she experiences rain for the first time in her existence, it appears as though she is having a genuine emotional reaction. But just how authentic is this reaction? If we don't grant Joy any agency or sense of individuality, then what we're really seeing in this scene isn't genuine at all. It's just the output resulting from a complex system of algorithms designed to determine a reaction that will satisfy Joe's expectations and desires. And the filmmakers drive this ambiguity home. Just as the scene is reaching a sort of emotional crescendo, Joy's hologram is frozen and the whole experience is interrupted by an incoming message calling Joe back to work. Joy hangs there, totally still, and we're forced to ask ourselves what her character's experience of life really is. Did we just witness a real moment of emotion or not? Honestly, I can't answer these questions, but rather than trying to say anything definitive about Joy, I think it's more interesting to consider how Joe feels about her. Does Joe think that Joy is emotionally aware, or does he ultimately come to think of her as a machine that was designed to pacify his mind and prevent him from realizing his own individuality? And I think there are 2 scenes near the end of the film we can use to try and answer that question. These scenes take place after Joe has gone on the run from Wallace and the police, following evidence which he believes will lead him to his father. Joe follows the clues to find Deckard, the main character from the original film, living in seclusion to protect a child he's never met. However, Wallace's soldiers track Joe to the location, where they end up destroying Joy and capturing Deckard in order to extract information about the replicant child from him. Joe is left for dead, but is eventually saved by an underground group of replicants. They reveal that Joe is in fact not the replicant child. He's just another replicant made by Wallace. And the underground replicants task him with tracking down Deckard and retiring him before he can reveal anything to Wallace. The first scene we'll be looking at more closely is this one, where Deckard is brought to Wallace's compound before being taken off-world for interrogation. Wallace confronts Deckard and tries to persuade him to cooperate by presenting him with the love of his life, Rachel, or at least a reproduction of Rachel. However, Deckard rejects Wallace, recognizing that although this version of Rachel may have the same DNA and many of the same implanted memories as the woman he loved, it's not really her. Wallace kills the replicant and laments Deckard's unwillingness to cooperate. In the very next scene, we see Joe experience a very similar situation. Joe has made his way back to the city, where he comes across a large holographic billboard advertising the Joy operating system. The hologram tries to seduce Joe, even calling him by the same name that Joy gave him. Joe silently stands before the hologram, its eyes blackened and hollow, and looks at the gun gripped in his hand. After a moment of thought, Joe leaves to go after Deckard and put a stop to Wallace's plans. In both of these scenes, Deckard and Joe are each confronted with inauthentic reproductions of their significant others. Deckard makes it clear that he rejects this reproduction, but Joe's reaction is harder to read because he remains, characteristically, silent. But I believe his decision to go after Deckard implies that he too has chosen to reject the false reproduction before him and embrace the relationship he shared with his Joy. He chooses to see the Joy he knew as being a real being and not just some system of control. And that choice motivates him to continue his rebellion, to continue to see himself as more than just a slave and fight against Wallace. While we can't say for sure that this is Joe's motivation, I think the filmmakers indicate that we are meant to connect Deckard and Joe's reactions in these scenes. The first indication is the fact that these two scenes play out consecutively and ultimately present such similar situations. We see Joe confront the hologram in the street immediately after seeing Deckard reject the false Rachel. Beyond that, there are indications in the dialogue and imagery that suggest these two scenes are deeply connected. Before Wallace reveals the clone of Rachel, he delivers this line.
You think I have nothing to offer but pain? Only I know you love pain. Pain reminds you the joy you felt was real. More joy, then.
This line directly connects the presentation of this false version of Rachel with joy. And I can't think that it's a simple coincidence that Wallace chose to use the word joy multiple times here. Another thing I found interesting is that when Deckard rejects the Rachel clone, he delivers the following line.
Her eyes were green.
What's interesting about this is that Rachel didn't have green eyes. She had brown eyes just like her clone. It's possible Deckard was referring to the green he saw in Rachel's eyes when giving her the Voight-Kampff test in the original film, but I think it's more likely that he lied to Wallace here, to indicate that no matter how close his replica might come to replacing Rachel, Wallace will never be able to fully recreate the person that Deckard fell in love with. And what's really interesting is that by drawing our attention to Rachel's eyes, the filmmakers create another connection to Joe's interaction with the hologram. The hologram's eyes were blacked out, with no color at all. And this provides further evidence that Joe's reaction to the hologram mirrors Deckard's reaction. He saw a false reproduction of something he loved, and he rejected it, instead choosing to value his memory of the real thing. Alright, so those are my thoughts on how Joe viewed his relationship with Joy, but like I said before, I can't say for sure if that's what's really happening in this scene. I like the idea of Joe and Joy being sort of kindred spirits, one a biological slave and the other a mechanical slave. But through their interactions, both are able to break free of their constraints and choose to be more than slaves. They choose to be free together. But so much of the film is left open-ended, and I love that because every time I watch Blade Runner 2049, I might walk away with a completely different understanding of the film than the last time I saw it. I can learn something about myself based on how I interpret the story, and that is a truly beautiful thing. And the fact that Joy is intentionally written to be ambiguous was more or less confirmed by Michael Greene, one of the film's screenwriters. He discussed creating the character with Adam Savage and Norm Chan on an episode of Still Untitled, The Adam Savage Project.
So then I saw Joy, and I just thought, oh, she's just a method of control from...
May well be. May well be. As I say, all of these things have to be true. Where do you land on that?
I think on that side as well,
Okay.
as a mirror for Kay. And his desires. And
it's funny. I argued with Denis and I discussed this a lot. I always felt like I wanted her to be real, and therefore but I couldn't. But the story had to allow her to be both. Mm-hmm. Is there an epochal moment in her coding where she becomes something she wasn't, or is it all fantasy, or does it matter?
No, and I think that.
And that's where I'm going to wrap up this discussion of Blade Runner 2049. I've spent a lot of time laying out my thoughts on the film, but I'm really interested in hearing what other people have to say about it. Do you think Joy was just a machine with no sense of emotion or any freedom of will? Or do you think there's more going on with her character? Do you think Joe looked back on his relationship with Joy as being real and fulfilling? Or do you have a different interpretation entirely? Let me know in the comments below. Once again, this has been Reflections on Film, and as always, thanks for watching.